Fantastic. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the Orbis Cascade Alliance Accessibility Days. I'm so happy you're here. Our first thing that we want to go through is our Orbis Cascade Alliance Code of Conduct. Elizabeth will be dropping the link to it in chat, but our goal is to ensure that all of our community members can engage with each other in our space, communities, and activities free from discrimination, harassment, and sexual assault. Mutual respect for each person's rights and dignity is central to the core of Alliance values. Next slide, please. Our accessibility days will be hosted today and tomorrow. I hope you're able to show up for both of it. Next slide, please. And before we get started, just a very quick housekeeping. You'll note that this session is being recorded. Everything is going to be recorded and posted on our website afterwards. I'm going to drop the link to our website in chat. If I can get there, because it's being recorded, I ask that you stay muted unless you are talking. And I also say, please add, if there's a cat in the video, it's fantastic. Please add questions to our chat at any time. Lori and I will be watching that throughout. If you have any technical issues, please send a private message to Elizabeth Duell and she'll be able to help you out, and that'll pop it right to the front so she doesn't miss it in the flurry of Q&A. Keeping your camera on is completely optional. Lots of us will be taking our cameras off, and so don't worry about whichever way you go. And I also want to note that we have a slight schedule change for tomorrow. We bumped one presentation up, so we'll be ending our day at 2 instead of at 3. And before I bring it on to our keynote, I just want to say a big thank you to our captioner, Dana. I would like to thank the conference organizers, Elizabeth Duell for logistical support, and Lori Hildebrand, Emily Pearson, Stephanie Michael, and Laura Nesselrod for conference planning. I'm so happy that we are here today. Next slide, please. And I'm thrilled to be the one to introduce our keynote speaker, Jess Schomberg. Jess is a librarian from Minnesota State University Mankato. She got her MLAS from our very own University of Washington, and her research interests are in disability justice and accessibility. And I would like you to give her a warm welcome to your screens. And next slide, I will turn it over to Jessica.
Hello, thank you all for having me. I am no longer a catalogger, but for a long time I was. And so as soon as I got the invitation to present for Orbis Cascade, I was like, you all do amazing work. And I have having worked with some of your organizers to put this session on, I can see why you're held in such high esteem. Just so far, it's been a fabulous experience. And I hope the session goes well and that the next couple of days go well for all of you. It's really exciting to see what you're working on. Before I jump into the slide session, I kind of wanted to ground what we'll be talking about today. Disability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. One way that I try to look at it is as a form of human variation. And human variety comes in a lot of, there's a lot that makes up human variety. And that means that no one person can know everything. And we all need to work together to actually pool the knowledge that we have, pool the insights that we have, and listen to people with lived experience. No one person can create disability justice on their own. A note on the presentation, using what I've learned from watching other disability justice presentations, I will try to speak slowly and clearly to make the captioner's job a little easier. I'll be reading all of the text on the slides so that people with low vision, poor internet connections, or who are listening while driving know what I'm referring to. I don't have any images in this presentation, but if I did, I would provide verbal descriptions of those images so people who can't easily see them will know what they are and the purpose they serve. As with many of the things we'll be discussing today, intentionally taking steps to include people with disabilities also makes events more accessible to others at the same time. Next slide, please. So what is disability justice? Disability justice is a little different from the civil rights model of disability accessibility, which is based on legally prescribed civil rights that modify existing structures to include disabled people without changing societal structures as a whole through things like reasonable accommodation. And sometimes people to put people with disabilities in conflict with people of color and other marginalized groups, as if those groups don't overlap. Disability justice, however, was created by disabled people of color and disabled queer people. And it's not about retrofitting existing systems. It's about dismantling and cooperatively rebuilding a more just world. And again, it's built on the idea that all bodies are unique and essential, that human variability is part of what makes us us. Disability justice was originally crafted by disabled queer women of color, including Patty Byrne, Mia Mingus, Stacey Milburn, who were later joined by Leroy Moore, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. And you'll see some of these names again later in the presentation because I try to cite their work wherever it seems appropriate. And what Patty Byrne, in describing disability justice, says, "We cannot comprehend ableism without grasping its interrelations with heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, each system co-creating an ideal body-mind built upon the exclusion and elimination of a subjugated other from whom profits and status are extracted." So the model of human variability and the model of disability justice is really at odds with a model of everyone has to fit into a pre-existing norm. Next slide, please. So a brief note on disability theories. We won't get into these, but knowing what these different theories are, in addition to making this presentation a little bit more understandable, they also, once you recognize what these different theories are, and once you start seeing them in the world, it can kind of make a lot of conversations a little more easy to understand, and also sometimes a little funnier. I will say, once I learned about the difference between the religious model and other models, when I was confronted in real life with the religious model, I didn't take it as personally, and it was a little easier for me to laugh at it when it was directed against me. So that's, there are a lot of reasons to know what these different theories are, but one of them is just kind of self-protection if you happen to be a person with disability. So the first one on this list is the moral or religious model, which views disability as a punishment or a sign of sin, and it's often tied in with charity and saviorism. Medical model has a more scientific focus, so it's less likely to accuse someone of having committed a sin to be disabled, but the focus is on treating and diagnosing individuals who happen to have a condition. The rehabilitation model is focused on fixing people to fit society. The social model is based on fixing society to support people. And you can see there's a big jump between those two models on who needs to be fixed and who is labeled as at fault or defective. The social justice model is also very much based on civil rights and a civil rights model, and actually came out of African-American civil rights movements from, well, I'd say the 20th century, but those movements started before then. But that's where that came from. And a critical model includes disability justice. And that creates a bridge between the medical and social models. Sometimes the social model says that we have to fix society. It ignores that some of us have bodily conditions that we need a little help with too. So bridging those models and recognizing that sometimes people do need individual treatment in addition to society needing to change. The critical models also have more skepticism about the limits of the civil rights model, and the focus is on making a world without ableism. Next slide, please. And what is ableism? Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed views of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism using this definition. And the person who wrote this is Talila A. Lewis, who goes also by TL. TL has revised this since I put it on the slide. And TL works with people on a regular basis to revise this definition of ableism as TL learns more and gets feedback from people who TL is in community with. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about the disability justice model, is that it grows and as people learn, and it's not very little that I've noticed in disability justice is a static model. It's always built in community and grows with community. Next slide, please. So what are the principles of disability justice? Back one slide, please. Thank you. There are 10 principles of disability justice as identified by Sin's Invalid, which is a performing arts group based in San Francisco, and they've done a lot of amazing work. So those of you who are in that region and maybe can get to San Francisco a little easier, might be able to meet up with them at some point. The 10 principles of disability justice. 1, intersectionality is the first one. And intersectionality, it kind of grew out of the critical race theory, critical legal theory work, and really identifies how ableism intersects with racism, white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and has described a lot of those intersectional oppressions leave a lot of the world in invalid or invalid status as being less than a normative human ideal. And I know that this is really academic sounding right now. We'll get into a little bit more practical implications in a few slides for those of you who are really itching for that. But to understand the theory that we're working on makes our practical work a little better. The second principle is leadership of those most impacted. So people who are impacted by ableism and disability oppression have a leadership role in everything. 3, anti-capitalism. And you've heard me say a few times how capitalism and ableism and racism are all built in the same system. So to disassemble those systems, we have to look at all of them. 4, cross-movement solidarity, to look at how social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism across feminist movements, anti-racist movements, and other social justice movements are important. We don't live in a silo. Number 5 is recognizing wholeness, that people have inherent worth outside of commodity relations and capitalist notions of productivity. Each person is full of history and life experience. Number 6, sustainability. And that's sustainability of us as humans, that we pace ourselves individually and collectively to be sustained long-term. Our embodied experiences guide us toward ongoing justice and liberation. Number 7, commitment to cross-disability solidarity. We honor the insights and participation of all our community members, knowing that isolation undermines collective liberation. And this gets a little back to what I said at the opening, that there's so much human variability. Each of us brings something to the table, and sometimes those needs are aligned and sometimes they conflict. So we have to work together to make sure that all of us fit. Number 8, interdependence. We meet each other's needs as we build toward liberation, knowing that state solutions inevitably extend into further control over our lives. So this kind of talks a little bit about how we have to look out for each other rather than expecting a police state to do that. Collective access, that looks at the nuances that go beyond able-bodied normativity to be in community with each other. And a lot of what I've seen related to disability justice in libraries is really heavily focused on the collective access principle. And we'll get into a little bit more of that later. And number 10, collective liberation. No body or mind can be left behind. Only moving together can we accomplish the revolution we require. And there's a question in the chat about whether sustainability also includes ecological sustainability. My answer to that would be yes, because the environment we live in, I mean, yes, and I have a really long answer to that we don't have time to get into, but it's a really good question. And I wish we, like if we had hours instead of a 40-minute time slot, I would happily go more in depth there. Next slide, please. All right, so if I were teaching this as a class instead of as a presentation to library professionals, this is where I would take a break because I've been talking for almost 20 minutes, and a lot of teaching pedagogy mentions the importance of taking like a 10-minute break after 20 minutes of talking for people to process and maybe like work in pairs or write down their notes. I'm not going to do that because I've seen enough people complain about that on Twitter to know that that's not going to go well. People don't always enjoy that as much as I do personally. So I'm not going to make you do that. However, if you are listening to a recording now and you can take a little pause to write down your thoughts and give yourself about 5 minutes to process, I just dumped a lot of information on you and that can be helpful, or keep going as we're going to do in this live session. So now we're going to switch over from disability to theory to what disability justice means in libraries. The collective access principle is one that I've seen mentioned a few times. A few examples of that are in the living of the motto, "Nothing about us without us," which came out of the disability civil rights movements a few decades ago, where nothing about disability should be decided without people who have disability having a voice in that. Nathan Sentence is a Aboriginal librarian in Australia, or Indigenous librarian in Australia. I'm not sure on the Australian terminology, so but hopefully you know what I'm trying to say. And one thing that he says in this essay that is linked in the chat is that we need to treat lived experience as expertise. People who have experience being disabled have a lot of insights into what that means and have a lot of things that they can share with us about making libraries better for them. And listening to them is really informative. Another part of collective access is recognizing that access is not problem solving, as noted by librarians Lena Kumbier and Julia Starkey. Disability experience has social, economic, and political stakes, and policies are not substitutes for action. And the third point on the screen, Dana Bishop-Root and Dustin Gibson talk about a home for disability justice within libraries and how they want to find that home in libraries, but haven't been able to. And they note that not only have disabled people been hidden away, but their stories, histories, and contributions have as well. And I'm more familiar with Library of Congress classification, and I know where disability stories are pathologized in that system. I'm guessing a lot of you use Dewey. I'm less familiar with that, but that might be something worth investigating if you are curious. A few things that I would like to note also about disability justice in libraries. Disability justice works against the status quo. It works against, this is how we've always done that. That means that we can't say that we're neutral and also pursuing disability justice. Those are not the same principles. Disability justice, if we're working towards that, that means those of us from dominant groups need to get used to feeling uncomfortable as we examine and critique the systems that have benefited us through our lives. Disabled people need to be involved at the planning, design, and decision-making level. Disabled people with a variety of disabilities and with a variety of racial or ethnic backgrounds. And non-disabled people need to check their saviorism instincts. And I know that at least for those of us who were socialized into white middle class backgrounds, that's a hard thing to face sometimes. Also, just as a note, taking a checklist approach to making libraries accessible to people with disability often means we're not questioning the organizing principles of libraries. We're checking off boxes and calling it done. And that isn't necessarily a bad place to start, but as we mentioned a little earlier, disability justice is based on a living organism model where we grow. So if we're starting with a checklist because that is how we learn, that's what we do, but that's not where we stop. That's just a starting place. And I think looking at the time, we'll go to the next slide, please. So what does disability justice mean for you? Well, it's going to mean different things to different people. But one thing I've learned through my own process of getting familiar with disability justice as a person with disabilities and as a person who had to work through some socialization that created some internalized ableism, you need to get used to discomfort and uncertainty. There's no recipe for making disability justice happen. There's no roadmap showing where the end goal is. And there really is no end goal. It's an ongoing journey that we co-create. We need to read, listen, observe, question our observations, and observe again, ask questions, get embarrassed, repeat. As April Hathcock said, you're gonna screw up. So learn how to get used to not being perfect, and just keep improving. Next slide, please. But practically speaking, what does disability justice mean? I'm pretty sure the beeping wasn't me, so somebody might need to mute themselves. So think about unhelpful and helpful library practices. An unhelpful library practice would be building a new library that lacks automatic doors and elevators. There's a library in New York City I could name that was recently built with no automatic doors or elevators. Not great for people with disabilities, not great for people who are pushing strollers, not great for people who are pushing book carts, although I believe there's a staff side that does have elevators. Another unhelpful library practice is to cram as much as possible into a tiny space so people can't move around. Punishing people for asking for work accommodations, unhelpful. Silently accommodating injustice, also unhelpful. More helpful, inviting in queer disabled people of color to work with you in cooperatively revising policies and practices, and pay them for their expertise as appropriate. Some people on disability benefits can't accept pay. So I'm not saying just we must pay everyone, because not everyone can accept it. Some people would prefer to build a relationship with you than to have a transactional commodified relationship, and you need to respect that as well. But in general, recognizing that disabled people also have to pay the electric bill can kind of guide some of your decisions there. Provide a variety of spaces to meet a variety of needs. I'll say for myself, I have, thinking about website design, I have astigmatism, and I recently learned that white text on a black background is why I get migraines sometimes. However, a lot of people who don't have astigmatism find that white text on a black background reduces their migraines. So things that meet the needs of one group of people may not meet the needs of another group of people. So providing flexibility and variety as much as possible is helpful. Another helpful practice is to make work accommodation policies easy to find, consistently applied, and as flexible as possible. Rather than silently accommodating injustice, if you see something unjust, raise a fuss. I was trying to make that into a slogan, but that's not my skill set. So feel free to rewrite that as needed. I will caution that if you are seeing something that seems to be unjust, check in with the person who the injustice seems to be directed towards to see how they want to pursue it. Some people might have different ways that they would like it to be handled. And Lori, thank you. If you see an unjust bit, pitch a fit. Yes, I like that. And then the last one, as a person with health conditions who has not been able to really go much of anywhere the past several months, wear a mask if you can. Not everybody can, but you make it safer for the people who can't if you do. Next slide, please. So bringing disability justice to work. The links here take you to two different articles that talk a little bit about how I worked with people at my library to try to incorporate disability justice in a way that we hadn't before. The first article, Asking the Right Questions, Accessibility in Library Study Rooms, is an article that I co-wrote with my boss. I invited him to co-write that piece with me because I knew that he was open to learning more about disability and accessibility And I also knew that he would need an end goal, and might need to be persuaded to do some things that I wanted. And so using the disability justice principles of building solidarity, I invited him into my work to help him understand what the situation is with disability in libraries in a way that he hadn't before. And that makes him a little bit more open to conversations that would be really challenging without having that background knowledge. In addition to that, we were able to produce a little write-up of why it matters that we learn as we go, that we get the right people involved, and the right people include disabled people, and that we invite critique from disabled people, because we can't do it all alone. And we need to get as many voices as we can. And people who are critiquing us are giving us a gift. They're saying, I trust you enough to let you know what you're doing wrong. I trust you enough to recognize that you want to do right by me. And I believe that you can do right by incorporating these things. So I really try to look at critique and negative feedback as a gift that people are giving. They believe that we can do better. They believe that we will listen. They believe that we value them. And we show them that we value them, that we will listen, that we will get better by honoring their critique, taking it in, letting them know that we're taking it in, and incorporating that into making improvements. The next piece in there that's linked there is library study spaces and accessibility. And this was a project that I worked on with one of our, because I work on a university campus, I worked with one of our instructional designers. I worked with the head of our accessibility resources office, and I worked with a student research assistant who wanted to get more experience doing research on how to serve people with disabilities. And we went through the disability principles, we went through library space design research, and we tried to map or crosswalk disability justice principles with library space design planning research, and went out and asked library users what they thought of various principles. We did not ask people to self-identify as being disabled because there's a stigma about that. And also some people have disabilities and don't know that, or they don't conceptualizing themselves as having disabilities, especially when you have a group of like 18 to 22-year-olds. They may learn that over time, but based on my own experience of being disabled and not recognizing that I was disabled, that's maybe not something we can expect 20-year-olds to recognize. Some do, some don't. So we intentionally asked a diverse array of people how they would like to provide input into library space design, how they want to use library spaces, what makes them feel like they do or don't belong. Intentionally designing for diversity by asking people with a wide range of physical appearances, which is the information that we had to go on. And knowing that about 25% of the US population does have a disability of some sort, we're just inferring that there were some disabled people in that population, so that we're trying to honor them in a way that doesn't make them self-identify. Whether that was the best way to do it or not, I think that's really open for discussion. But I like to do it again using a slightly different methodology, yes, of course. But that's what we did with the resources we had. And we have identified through that process ways to improve library services, space design, and also reconsider a little bit about what a virtual space might be like for people who want the library study experience, but can't, for a variety of reasons, physically enter the library. Next slide, please. So we're kind of getting towards the end, so start thinking of your questions if you haven't already. One thing that I have really benefited from over the years is the wide variety of writings and recordings from people with disabilities who freely share their insights with the world. The Disability in Libraries Toolkit draws on many of the resources discussed here to facilitate reflection and learning in library contexts. The Disability Visibility Project includes oral articles, oral histories, anthologies, book circles, and it was created by Alice Wong through, I believe, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to start recording oral histories of people with disabilities as they go through the world. And this includes discussions about museum spaces, art collections, public health, intersectionality, mental health, doctors. It's a wide gamut of resources. Project LETS, or LETS, provides recommended books and videos with a mental health focus. Talila A. Lewis has several publications focusing on deaf, blind, and disabled people, particularly incarcerated people. And Imani Barbaran, who also goes by Crutches and Spice, is a writer active on social media and incredibly insightful. I learn new things from her constantly. In her own words, she writes from the perspective of a Black woman with cerebral palsy. And these are all really great places to start, in addition to some of the disability justice leaders mentioned earlier, like Patty Byrne and Mia Mingus. So on that, I just tried to forward the slide, but I cannot. So Elizabeth, next slide, please. Thank you. So getting to questions. I see lots of things in the chat, and I cannot remember if someone is facilitating this part. Sagan?
I can help with facilitating this part.
Thank you so much.
There are a lot of questions in here. I think you answered the one about sustainability, including ecological sustainability during the talk. There were some comments. I'm kind of reading it aloud just because there's also the recording and sometimes chat doesn't show up. There is some comments about if you see an unjust bit, pitch a fit, and another comment saying, I like it, but I can see it turning into an unfortunate tongue twister. There was a comment saying my daughter took a couple of years in college before seeking accommodation for a disability, felt her disability wasn't valid and didn't want to take from others. That's not a question, but I was curious if you had anything you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common. I know that was the mental process I went through as well. I don't really have advice. I know for me, learning about the social model of disability helped me work through that. So if you want to share that with people, that might be helpful. But I think that's a thing that a lot of us just kind of work through. And I will say, if you are covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act, or if you should be, I know some conditions aren't because of weird reasons, but go ahead, count yourself. You're one of us.
There's a question. I'm curious how you could include the perspectives of people who do not enter the library because they've already found it inaccessible.
I'd say leave the library, go out into the community. It's been a weird couple of years, which sometimes makes that harder. But if you happen to know of organizations in your, I'm assuming you're a public library person. So I'd say identify organizations in your community that work with people with disabilities, and just say, hey, we want to serve this population better. Can you help get me connected with people who'd be willing to talk with me?
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in chat yet, but please feel free to unmute if you have a question you'd like to ask, or raise your hand. I can keep an eye on that.
not so much a question, but I think the reassurance of you're gonna screw up is really, really important to me. I code myself as a rule follower. And so when I know I've made a big mistake, I just feel awful about it. So giving people the idea that it's normal to make mistakes here. If you're not making mistakes, you're not pushing the boundary. And so I appreciate that very much, and thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of us get into this field because we have perfectionistic tendencies. And that's a hard lesson, but a helpful one. I fully expect that there are people who will 5 minutes after this be like, oh, I have discovered a question. Feel free to email me. That's fine. My email should be easy to find, I think. It's just jessica.schomberg@mnsu.edu. And I am very open to questions. I will put it in the chat. So it might be a little easier.
We had another question come in. Do you have any resources for concerning language and alternatives to using words that many people don't realize might be offensive? I've seen some short lists, but haven't found a comprehensive resource yet.
Yes, there are two that come to mind, depending on if you prefer internet or book. I am looking up them right now. Here we go. So, you know, when you know somebody through their internet name, but not their real name, I'm having to think about that. So there's an autism advocate named Lydia XC Brown, who has compiled a list of resources. I've put the website in the chat. I think if you do a Google search for ableist words and terms to avoid, that should show up, knowing their name. And then there's also what is there's a book, and it's one of those, like, I have this book on my desk at work, but I don't have it here. Called How to Be a Disability Ally. If you like things in book form, that's a real good one. But it's not, oh, here it is. Demystifying Disability is the title. It is hard to talk and type at the same time. So this is, here we go, by Emily Ladow. And I will also put that in a link to that in the chat. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Those I would say would be the two sort of resources I would recommend people to. First, they're really good at contextualizing it and explaining why some terms can be hurtful.
There's another question. Do you have any suggestions for a situation where it is the library director / senior campus administrators who are hard-nosed about only recognizing ADA situations that were accompanied by a medical letter? Example, one day after helping someone move on a weekend, and the next day at library trying to bow out of lifting one day special project of heaving cartons.
I'm thinking. So, and please let me know if I'm misinterpreting your question. So I think with the example, one thing to keep in mind is that for a lot of people, disability can vary what can be really hard to do one day can be really easy the next day. I know for myself, sometimes I'm like, I have so much energy, and then I try to do everything at once, and then for the next 3 days, I have to sleep because I've used all of my energy. So that's the thing to keep in mind. When it's a library director or campus administrator who are hard-nosed about recognizing that flexibility and need, the only advice I have to give is to unionize and to get your union members to support you. At least I know on my campus, that's been more effective than trying to go through HR, is to have union advocates to back you up, to attend meetings with you, so that you're not alone. And so it's harder to gaslight you as you experience that sort of discrimination. That's a real hard one. The next advice I would have would be to call a lawyer, which, you know, that's all I've got. It's a hard question.
Someone added in chat the spoons analogy. I don't know if that would be one you'd recommend, or if you have comments on that one.
So for people who don't know what the spoons analogy is, Christine, I cannot remember her last name. I believe, if I remember right, she has lupus, or a similar disabling condition, talks about how you are given a certain number of spoons at the beginning of the day. It might not be the same number of spoons every day. I'm going to use these writing utensils as an example. Oh, they don't really show up well against the gray screen. But all right, you want to brush your teeth. Well, 2 spoons gone. You want to comb your hair, 1 spoon gone. You want to eat breakfast, 3 spoons gone. You want to drive to work, 1 spoon gone. Now you're at work. You have 2 spoons left for the rest of the day, and you still have to drive home. So that would be how spoon theory works in action. Yeah, it can be hard. That's about all I've got for that too.
So I know all the additional links I am copying into a separate Word document that I will get added somehow to the webpage.
All right, thank you.
I don't really have a question, but I've worked on our campus for a very long time, and the statement of what happens if people aren't really interested in accommodating disabilities, and part of the issue, it's the same issue with white supremacy in higher education, is that when you don't have what you need, you have to know more than the people who have what they need know. And you have to know how the rules work. So I am my wife's disability advocate. My human resources department is more afraid of me than I am of them. I have never worried about what they're willing to do because I know what they're exactly required to do, because I have no problem going above them to the state level. I'll just reach out to the Equal Opportunity Office and say, my university is failing to meet ADA accommodation needs as per federal law. I already have an attorney. What would you like my next steps to be? And they'll usually within 24 hours just do whatever it was that I asked them to do in the first place very nicely. But you have to do that. Just as faculty of color have to know all of the rules in order to make a complaint when they're not being met. So if you are able-bodied, and most people don't realize that you are one incident away from being disabled, that you take the time to be that advocate. If you've got the energy, please spend that energy. Some other people don't. Like you said, some days you wake up and if you're lucky, you got 3 spoons to work with. And not everybody knows that analogy, but some days, like when you say disability, when people say, oh, our building is ADA accommodating, congratulations, you have 1 door that is wheelchair accessible. That is a drop in a very large accommodation bucket. It can come all the way down to, do your seats have backs? Do they have cushions? Are your stairwells too tall? You know, do you have railings on your stuff? Like, there's so many little things, but we have to feel comfortable enough to ask. And I think for some people who are able-bodied, they think it's conflict generating. Just ask the question. Can you move around? How's it going? Does this place meet your needs? Is it too tall? Is it too short? You know, if you put all of your heavy stuff at the bottom, that may not be an ADA lack of accommodation, but in my building, most of the people who work here are like 80 years old. You're not getting that Atlas archive off of the bottom floor. So why is it there in the first place? So it's like the little things, because if you think about how to make your building more accessible, it actually makes it easier to use for everybody. And that can start conflict. So just sometimes it's all about chutzpah, just saying, you know what? We're going to accommodate this building if I have to set half of it on fire. Which would you prefer? Fixing the building or arson? And I know that I'm new to the library system, so most librarians are like, oh my God. But I find it a highly effective tactic because it is required by law that you make these accommodations. So if you make me pitch a fit about it, I'm going to ruin the rest of your day. And usually by then they roll. But unfortunately, we shouldn't have to get there, but it may be something that you have to kind of build a comfort level to do.
I thank you so much. I have there's a Joanna on my campus, not the same name, but his willingness to do that has made so many changes possible that weren't even on the table a few years ago. So thank you, Joanna, for speaking up and for standing up for people. And if find yourself a Joanna where you work and hype them up, because they do a lot of heavy lifting for us. I also would note something based on something you said. If I see an event labeled accessible or a building labeled accessible, I know that it's not. If you specifically mean you have power doors, say that you have power doors. If you specifically mean that you have one bathroom with a ADA approved handle and guardrails to help you sit, but you don't have a transfer station, don't say that your bathroom is accessible, because for some people it won't be. If you have elevators that don't have braille letters to help people who are blind get to other floors, that elevator is not fully accessible. So say specifically what it is that you have that you're offering. Also, I will say, like, I am a person who, for whatever reason, if we were all in a room physically together and it was a non-COVID experience and nobody was wearing a mask and there was no microphone, I would not be able to hear most of you. Like, I would hear your voices, but I would have no idea what you were saying because I need the microphone to understand words. Like, you can shout, but it's like freaking me out because you're shouting at me, but I still don't know the words you're saying. But I also know other people who that microphone is sensory overload. And so using a microphone makes it a more accessible experience for me and a less accessible experience for them. So that's another reason to be really specific about what you mean when you say accessible, because for some people that thing that you are doing will make it more accessible or possibly unaccessible. So just be as explicit as possible so people with disabilities can know ahead of time without having to call through about 3 or 4 different people to try to figure out if something actually is accessible. Oh gosh, yeah, and an elevator that is in stock room that doesn't have room between the boxes for a walker or wheelchair. Yeah, that's also a problem.
And if someone unmuted themselves, if you'd like to ask a question, please jump in. And in the meantime, just catching up on some of the comments, there's a note that There are at least 13 copies of Demystifying Disability floating around Summit Libraries, FYI, which, Jessica, that's our interlibrary loan consortia. Explaining invisible disabilities is challenging. Be steady, consistent, in persistence, and an advocate. Some more links. Like Jess said, get used to discomfort. Love this attitude. Yes, shake things up. And then quoting, do you prefer fixing it or arson? Best quote of the day. One thing that really stuck out to me in your presentation was the concept of remembering that everyone is a whole person. I find that with my upbringing in the Protestant tradition, that it can be really easy to, even if you're not preaching for that, to get into that mindset of like, oh, everything I do must be related to advocating for this. And that was a really good reminder for me. So thank you.